Good evening. Can you hear me? I hope you can. Yes, we're having slight problems with the sound, but I hope you can hear me. Richard says, I can hear something, only noise. Yeah, well, we will keep talking and hope that something can be sorted out here. Anyway, good evening and welcome to the next Friday conversation. And it's in part of the series we are doing Digging Deeper into Luke's Gospel. And we're looking particularly at themes that Luke particularly seems to emphasise in his Gospel. And this evening we're looking at how Luke focuses on Jesus' attitude to women. Unlike what it says on our Facebook page, it's not about women in the Bible. It's actually specifically digging into Luke's Gospel and how he presents Jesus and women. Andy says he can hear. That's good. So, yes, I'm Fiona. This is Sally.
Hello.
And we hope we'll be able to have a conversation without further glitches. Right, well, welcome, Sally.
Thank you.
Yes, and we've both been reading Luke's Gospel all the way through, particularly looking at every mention of women, every encounter of Jesus with women, and things which indicate things about women. And one thing that comes really clearly, especially if you have any awareness of the sort of culture background to the New Testament, is that actually Jesus is quite radical when it comes to his attitude to women.
Yes, he is. Yeah, very much so. So I had to look this up in the just to get a definition, but I'm sure most people are probably aware that in the time when Jesus was walking on the earth, the society was patriarchal. Yeah. And I thought, well, I think I know what that means, but I just looked it up, and basically it's denoting a system of society or government controlled by men. So the way that Jesus actually engaged women and drew them in, to be included, was actually really radical.
Yes, was quite radical, and I say particularly, some of the things we'll look at, we might not notice because they're so normal in our society, but actually in his society it was causing raised eyebrows, and we do several times, throughout the Gospels, and particularly here we're looking at Luke, find that either his disciples or his critics or other people are sort of thinking, what's he doing? Yes. It's quite interesting actually. The Gospel of Luke begins with the narratives about the birth of John the Baptist and Jesus. And in both we find that from the outset we see what the mothers are about. He actually, when he's explaining about the birth of John the Baptist, we have Gabriel appearing to Zechariah, the father, but we also see the reaction of the mother, Elizabeth, which is actually rather more inspiring than Zechariah's.
Yes.
Because obviously Zechariah doesn't believe him and ends up dumb until the baby's born, whereas Elizabeth obviously has actually responded with faith and gratitude to what God has done. Yeah. And then Gabriel goes to, having gone to Zechariah, in John's case, he goes to Mary and speaks to her about the forthcoming birth of Jesus. And we have the birth narrative as told from the perspective of Mary. Whether Luke ever actually met Mary or whether this was somebody else who'd met Mary telling him, but he quite likely could have met Mary, because he was contemporary with the early disciples. So that, and it is interesting, we hear things that only Mary could have told somebody, about what was going on in her heart, and that's actually seen as an important focus. And her great song of praise, the Magnificat. Yes, I don't know if you've got anything.
I haven't actually. I didn't really look much into Elizabeth and Mary of all the women there. They were the two that I didn't look too much into, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. But yes, it is interesting that often in Luke's Gospel you find that both with the way he's arranged the various stories in Jesus' teaching and also some of the accounts that are happening, that you sort of have a man-focused one and then a woman-focused one.
Yes, you have that with when Jesus was presented in the temple as well, because the Simeon there who takes Jesus, and then there's Anna, the widow, the prophet, and I thought that was lovely. That,
Yes.
It's male and female, man and woman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Luke is obviously very concerned that his gospel is directed not just to a Jewish audience; it's directed to everybody, and it's a much wider cultural background that's coming in there.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that, I mean, obviously we hear more about Simeon and his waiting for the coming of the Messiah and his prophetic words, but then we see here's Anna, who's also been there. So yes, that is, it's almost like Luke keeps underlining, that among the people responding, the people who are involved, there's men and women, and the women actually are as important in their response as the men, whereas the main society they were in, the men were where it was all happening, and the women were in the background making the food and sitting separately in the synagogues and all that sort of thing.
I found some sayings from the first century which were really quite shocking. I'll just read some to you. I'll just explain as well that I've been looking a lot at this book, Bible Speaks Today on Women, so if I keep referring to my book or the book, that's the one that I've been looking at. But there was a statement by Josephus, a Jewish historian, that said, the woman is in all things inferior to a man. And then the Desiring God website that I had a look at, they had an article which had two statements on it. Happy is he whose children are male, but alas for him whose children are female. And sooner let the words of the law be burned than delivered to women. It's unbelievable really now, isn't it?
Those are people writing at that time, which definitely put us, well, not just in the background, sort of out the door just about. So yes, actually, whereas in our society sometimes people read the New Testament and think, oh, it's misogynistic, it's all very patriarchal, but actually when you realise the background against which it's written, it is not. Jesus was definitely in the forefront of, given that that he's here to restore creation as it's meant to be. Of course, in the beginning, God created man in his own image, male and female. He created them, and said to both of them, "I want you to rule the earth." As my stewards. So that sort of equal partnership was there at the beginning and then was lost as a result of the fall.
Yes.
So yes, it's not surprising really when Jesus is here to restore all things that yes, he does actually have this quite radical attitude.
Yeah. Yes, because they're saying as well, I found out that rabbis wouldn't talk to women, and men generally didn't speak to women in the street, or I don't know if that was men in general or just rabbis. And the book said that many wouldn't talk to women out of cultural seemliness, but others because of misogyny.
Yes. So it's quite a radical thing that Jesus actually had women disciples as well as men disciples. See, I think sometimes people think he only had 12 disciples. Well, that's not so, I mean, he had his 12 that, were the kind of the team that were travelling with him and so on. But actually, he had far more than 12 disciples, Let's face it, a man who only managed to get 12 disciples, one of whom then decided to drop out, would hardly have been seen as a great threat by any of the authorities. But obviously it was the fact that there were so many people following him, men and women, that made him such a threat for his enemies.
Yeah. And some of those were women, because actual disciples rather than just kind of on the outskirts. Because if the definition of a disciple is taking up your cross and following Jesus, but they were doing the same as the men. So they'd heard Jesus teaching and responded. Some of them were using their personal resources as well, weren't they, to support the group?
That's right. Yes, we'll come to that in a minute. Because that's.
And they left their home and family behind to follow and lived a life of sacrifice and hardship. And I was reading as well that where a woman would be travelling around with a band of followers of Jesus, it would have been considered scandalous that they were staying in the homes of people that weren't their relatives as well.
Yes. Well, and that I think that's. I'm just looking for that bit here. Hang on. Make sure I get it in the right. Where is it? Gate 2 to 3. That's further back again. Yes. So yes, we know, of course, that the 12 apostles that he chose travelled about with him everywhere he went, and there were random people following as well. But in Luke chapter 8, and just at the beginning, it says this: after this, Jesus travelled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chusa, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. So actually, if you want to know how Jesus' ministry was funded, if you to put it crudely, a lot of women with sufficient wealth at their own disposal were actually following him.
Yes, yeah.
and paying the way.
Yes.
So actually, these women were following him around. That, as you say, that would have been scandalous for some people at the time. But in fact, it was Jesus happily allowed those women to do that.
Yeah.
And again, it just shows that he actually put a very different value on them from those rabbis who wouldn't speak to one, and even their own wife they would only talk to indoors and that sort of thing. You see that Jesus actually allows them not only to follow him, but actually receives the ministry that they have for him.
Richard's just mentioned on here that Jesus sent out the 72, and that I think I read something briefly on that in preparing for this, and it's never occurred to me before that the 72 might have included some women. I don't know what your opinion is on that, because it doesn't actually say, does it?
No. But it is possible. It's like when when Jesus' mother and brothers came to try and take charge of him because they thought he was getting a bit like he was losing his mind or something, and they arrive at this place and there's a crowded house and they can't get in, and so a message comes through to Jesus saying, your mother and brothers are outside wanting to speak to you. Now, it doesn't specifically say it in Luke's, but in one of the others it actually mentions the fact that Jesus says, my mother and brothers, and gesturing round to all his disciples, he says, these are my mother and my brothers and sisters. Now, that implies that among his disciples were women, because no man in a group of men would gesture around to his disciples and say, here are my mother and my brothers. It just wouldn't be, he might have said, these are my brothers, but the fact that he includes the mothers as well tells you that actually among these disciples that he says, these are my family, these are my disciples, are women. Yeah. And so yes, it's entirely possible.
Yes,
who knows? Yes, have you got any more? Just keep. I always tend to forget to look at all this. Yeah. No, it's a private conversation going on between Maddie and Maggie at the moment.
Oh, is it?
So we'll leave that one. Yeah. Right. Yes. So. Yes. That, and then also, I mean, when you look through the whole, we'll look a minute at some of the women he actually met and dealt with. But again, when it comes to the end of the story, as he's actually coming up to the cross, and then after his death, the women are very noticeably there when the men aren't.
Yes. Yeah.
Why do you think it would have been easier for the women to follow him to the cross than the men?
Well, that's really, obviously it's not really funny because I've been studying it as well, but yes, because at the end it does say, if I just find my little bit that I prepared. So 2 of the Gospels list the women by name who were at the cross, but they don't mention men at all. Luke does say those who had followed him were there, including, and I think including the women. John names some women, but only names himself. So yes, it's really interesting that the women are named by name, but none of the men are. So I don't really know, but I suppose it's assuming the men were there, I think there is a reference to the followers being there without naming the men. But I was wondering if it was such a big thing for the women to be there. I don't know whether women would have normally gone to a crucifixion. It just sounds so gory and horrible and whatever. But the fact that they love him and they've still gone to see him go through, it shows their loyalty.
And also, you know, to be fair, it actually was probably safer for them to go to be identified weeping than his disciples. Now, see, his disciples had run away because, in spite of having all said, yes, we'll follow you to death, they, you know, when it came to the crunch, they did sort of disappear, apart from John, it seems, having gone there. But for women, the authorities are not likely to feel that he is his followers, you know, because they'd be discounted. They would just be assumed to be
a threat, would they?
No, they would be much less of a threat. And so in some ways, women could actually go places where a man wouldn't be able to, because he might be attacked, whereas they could. So there is that side to it.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show they're not wimpy women.
They're not wimpy. They're incredibly loyal.
Yes, and to be there all the way through.
Yeah.
Yes. But then also, because they have seen him die, and then they've also watched as he's taken off for burial, so they definitely knew which tomb he was put in.
Yes.
And then they go off and get their spices and that ready, and then after the Sabbath they come, as they think, to anoint his body and sort of wrap it up and all the rest of it. So they didn't go to the wrong tomb because they were a bit dim.
No. No.
And I'm fairly sure that, you know, had they been to the wrong tomb, well, somebody would have gone to the right one soon after when they wanted to scotch this rumour that he'd risen from the dead. But actually they definitely knew, and so actually they ended up being the first witnesses to the resurrection.
Yes.
And the first testifiers to it. Which also was interesting was, what about the testimony of a woman in those days?
Yes, exactly. Yes, so they weren't considered reliable witnesses, were they?
No.
Yes, and the book I was reading, it actually just says that this whole thing about them being given that commission from Jesus to go and tell the brothers would have actually conferred a measure of authority on them in the early church. And the book said this provides the most affirmative evidence of the value of women as disciples of Jesus and their role as messengers of the gospel.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes. The fact that the angel at the tomb tells them to go and tell his disciples. Obviously, in angelic regions, women were not regarded as unreliable witnesses.
No.
And yes, they. Now, obviously, it seems the disciples, some of them thought, oh, you know, it's women, they're hallucinating, imagining things, and have to go and see for themselves. But of course then they find it's true.
Yes. Yeah.
You know,
but at least they went. They did actually, you know, after the initial doubt, they did actually go on the word of the women.
Yes. And of course the first recorded of appearance of Jesus after his resurrection is to Mary Magdalene. She's the first one to actually meet him risen from the dead.
Yeah.
So again, you know, he didn't go first to Peter, although obviously he was quite soon after, or first to any man. You know, his first appearance is to this woman in the garden.
I love that. I know, I don't think it's in Luke actually, but that.
No, it isn't. No.
And Jesus says, "Mary always chokes me up whenever I read that. I can hardly get through it without crying." Yes,
but yes, that is sort of quite an amazing thing, really. So still on this. Well, it might be moving into my next thing, but I'll...
Oh, Maddie's put something on there.
Oh, right, let's see.
There are still some parts of the Middle East where women are still treated badly, and then Richard said, like Afghanistan.
Yes, yeah. And Maggie saying, I'd never thought of women at the cross in that way before, you know, the bit about them being... yes, in fact, I had never thought of that either, but there's a very useful book that I've found by Kenneth Bailey called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, and it was in a chapter, I think somewhere in there, he was sort of saying, you know, how because he's ministered out in the Middle East, and he was saying that even when you are in a kind of a war zone where a man out in the street is likely to be regarded as a potential threat or attacked. You know, women sort of can get by quite freely. Yes. So it is quite an interesting point there, isn't it?
Yes, I'm just going. I don't know what anybody would think about this if I can find my first page, but I did read something. John Piper, he said that wherever Christianity has become deeply rooted in a culture, the treatment of women has improved. And I suppose I don't know, could be argued or not, I don't know, but I would probably agree with him.
Yes. Well, yes, I quite agree with you, because even in our own society, you know, where I'm aware that women haven't always had the freedom and equality that they're granted today legally, but actually over the centuries there has been a sort of a moving towards a recognising women as with their dignity and their equality, and the gradual realisation that they're, you know, that intelligence isn't something that is inherently absent from women and always present in men. You know, that sort of, I mean, we take it for granted now, you know, that girls can be educated the same as boys can, that women can do careers that were hitherto the province of men, that we have the vote, you know, and all that kind of thing. But those things are much more notable in societies which have been strongly influenced and shaped by Christianity, whereas in societies that haven't been, you largely find that women still occupy a much less favourable position than now. So yes, that I think it's an important thing to see, because so often the church gets accused of being, you know, well, particularly by the sort of extreme feminist lobby, of being sort of very anti women and supporting this patriarchal domination and what have you. But actually, when you see where things have come from, that's not so. The church has been in the vanguard of actually recognising the value of women, because Jesus did.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, and in a minute we'll be going on to the song and notices, but as a kind of a bridge point, I just want us to look a bit at the story of Mary and Martha, which comes in Luke chapter 10, I believe. Yes, at the home of Mary and Martha. Fairly familiar story. Give us a quick recap of it.
Oh my goodness, on the spot. Yes, so Jesus visits the home of Mary and Martha, who lived in Bethany, I believe, were the sisters of Lazarus, who Jesus raised from the dead. And as the story goes, Jesus is sitting with his disciples at his feet, and included in those disciples is Mary sitting at his feet, while Martha is busy in the kitchen busy with the preparations and preparing the meal and everything. And so Martha says to Jesus, "Tell my sister to come and help me with all these chores." And Jesus very, I think very graciously, doesn't kind of criticise or have a go, but just says, she's chosen the better part and it's not going to be taken from her.
Yes.
So he actually he endorses it really.
Yes. And it's a very significant thing. See, so often we read that and then people want to talk about the difference between the doers and the contemplators and things, which, you know, has its valid point. But that's not actually what was really upsetting Martha. I mean, bearing in mind that when Jesus came to the place, it wasn't a quiet dinner for the five of them. You know, there's Jesus, there's his disciples, there's this gaggle of women following him and all the rest of it. So, you know, it isn't like there would be a shortage of manpower in the or woman power in the kitchen. What has actually scandalised Martha is the fact that Mary has gone in among the men and is sitting at Jesus' feet listening to his teaching. And if you've been looking up, you know, what does it mean to sit at someone's feet?
Yes, so if somebody is, it's like Jesus is the rabbi and Mary is sitting at his feet learning, so he is teaching her as a rabbi would teach a disciple. Yes,
I mean, Paul, when he's describing his own credentials, you know, he says that, you know, he sat at the feet of Gamaliel. In other words, Gamaliel was his rabbi, and that sat at the feet of meant you have become a disciple of this rabbi. Now, the normal picture even today in a lot of cultures, and certainly in those days, would have been that at an event like this where this great rabbi has come to town, the men, the disciples, will be sitting listening to his teaching while the women are busy catering and getting things ready in the kitchen, and it's always quite separate. You know, I remember when Lois was travelling in India, that was one of the things that was sort of very noticeable in a Muslim home she went to, you know, was that the men sat and ate and the women ate afterwards in the kitchen, you know, and the two don't mix, that's, or not normally. Now, here we have Mary. It's not just the fact that she's not sort of taking her turn at the potatoes or whatever. The problem is she's behaving like a man. Yeah. She's sitting there and she's sitting learning. See that bit you read earlier about, you know, better to throw the teaching out than to have it delivered to a woman.
Yes.
You can imagine this is really quite a scandalous thing. So she's behaving as somebody who's a disciple.
Yes.
And I find it really encouraging that Jesus accepted that, encouraged it, and actually backed her up and said, no, she has chosen the better part and it's not going to be taken from her. And I find that's really wonderful, how he's not just kindly patronised her, he's actually affirmed her. No, she can be my disciple too.
And I love as well, I know it's kind of slightly off the point, but I love that he doesn't really criticise either one. So he doesn't say to Martha, well, you should be down here too, you're wrong for doing that. And neither does he say to Mary, you know, get up and help your sister. No. He's got that lovely balance of, you know, gentleness, graciousness and...
Yes, well, he actually says to Martha, and it is a gently critical way, Martha, you're troubled and distracted,
yes, he does,
anxious about many things. So it says, because Martha was distracted. See, Mary's focusing on Jesus and his teaching. Martha's a bit distracted with all the preparations in the kitchen. He says, you're worried and anxious about many things. Only one thing is needful. And Mary has chosen it, basically. So, you know, I'm not taking it from her. I think that's really quite an important one.
Oh, it seems like there's still a problem with the sound.
Yeah. Oh dear. Right, well, we'll now go to the song and notices then, and hope that the sound will be better by the time we get back again. Okay, so we're off, aren't we?
Yeah. Preparations in the kitchen. It hasn't caught up to it on my phone, so we don't know if it's...
Basically, so, you know, I'm not taking it from her. It's not much in the comments. Well, no, because there's a lot of names in there, because like Keith and Anna. Right, well, we'll now go to the song. Oh. We still got the song on our thing. Oh, we're back on, aren't we? Yes, our screens and our sound are not quite syncing here. But anyway, welcome back. It seems there are still some problems with the sound, so we are skipping from the song and notices back into the studio. I hope you can all hear me now.
Oh dear.
Oh, sorry, still silent, says Maggie. Right. Okay, we'll keep going and hope for the best, shall we, and let them work it out. Right, where are we? Oh yes, let's have a look at some of the women Jesus meets as we're going through this gospel.
Yes. Did we do the sick woman in a crowd? Can we do that one?
Yes.
Because the reason I like this one, because...
This is the one in... where are we?
It's the lady with the issue of blood. The one.
Yes, I'm just looking for the reference.
Luke 8:40 to 56.
That's right, yes. Yeah. Yes, Luke 8, 43 onwards, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, carry on then.
Yeah, so this lady has been poorly for, I think it says 12 years, and had a problem with this issue of blood. So it's something that's actually would cause her a social stigma, and she would have probably been labelled as unclean and been quite dismissed from society. And when she's touched Jesus' clothes and she's healed, I could never understand really, bearing in mind drawing attention to her after that would have probably caused her more embarrassment, because she would then have to have confessed in front of the whole crowd, this was what was wrong with me and I've touched you and now I'm healed. And I thought, well, would Jesus have known that, and why did he do that? Because it almost felt like he was adding to her humiliation. But when I was reading about it again in this book, it was so lovely for her, it really was. So apparently it says in Leviticus 15 that when she's been cleansed from this discharge, she was required to bring a couple of doves or pigeons to the priest, who would then offer them to make atonement for her, and she would have been restored to her normal place within the community. But what they were explaining is that Jesus actually acts as that priest who would restore her. So by what I felt was humiliating her, not deliberately I'm sure, but in front of all these people, he was actually restoring her to the place in the community. He was actually leaving no doubt in their minds that the social stigma had ended, that she had the right to resume her place in worship, in the community. So Jesus in effect gave her back not just her health but her human dignity as well.
Yes,
which was lovely.
Yes, right. And a few weeks ago, I remember preaching on this particular passage, and while I was preparing for it, one of the things that really struck me was he calls her daughter.
Yes.
When he says to her, daughter, go in peace. Your faith has made you well, and it's actually that is the only person he ever addresses as daughter.
Is it?
That word, actually calling somebody daughter, it's her, which really is such an affirmation of her, because that's the thing, he's not seeking to embarrass her, he's actually affirming her, which is really important. I mean, he does actually refer to another woman as a daughter of Abraham, but this is the only woman that he actually addresses as daughter, which is, and again, that's very important, isn't it? That he hasn't just come to restore the sons of God, he's come to restore the daughters of God as well. And that's
that one, the daughter of Abraham. Can you remember which one that was? Because that was here. It was a crippled.
Yes, that's the crippled woman. It's in Luke 13, verse 10. Yes, she was a lady who'd been bent double for 18 years, and he healed her on the Sabbath. Again, he's in the synagogue, but he notices this little bent woman.
Because he notices her, and she doesn't have to ask him, does she?
No.
And I think that's lovely too, because she would have been ignored by everybody. She would have been dismissed basically by society. But he actually sees her and invites her to be healed.
That's right. Yes. Well, he actually calls her forward so everybody sees. And then, of course, as we know, there was all this issue about healing on the Sabbath and everything. But yes, what he says, yes, it's fine to do this on the Sabbath. If it was your ox or donkey, you'd lead it out to have its water. Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath from what bound her? Yes. So it's like he's sort of saying, I see this woman, I see a daughter of Abraham. Yes, and actually she's more important than the ox or donkey that you were going to lead out for water. So, why are you all criticising me, basically? Yeah. Yes, and that's one of the things, the fact that he notices her in the crowd. And if she was bent double, she wouldn't have been a prominent person in the crowd if you're bent double. But there's another one. We won't go at length into this one because Nick is going to be preaching on it on Sunday, and we don't want to sort of preempt his sermon. But the woman in the house of Simon the Pharisee, who comes and pours her ointment over Jesus' feet and is weeping over him, and she's a woman who's known to have a rather seamy past, and Jesus tells this parable about the two debtors and which one will love you more for having forgiven the debt and all that sort of thing. But one of the things that strikes me is that when he's sort of speaking to the Pharisee who's been looking down his nose at this woman, in fact judging Jesus, he says to her, "Do you see this woman?" And then proceeds to talk about how, unlike you who weren't even polite to me, she's actually really gone over the odds. But it's that, do you see this woman?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's like Jesus is sort of saying, well, I see her. And it's not just that I see her and sort of complain about her. I see her, and I know what's going on in her heart. And he's bothered about it. He actually cares about what's going on in our hearts, and he actually sees into us and understands it. I find that's an incredibly encouraging thing for me, that because Because sometimes, you know, it's like you think, oh, nobody really gets me, nobody really understands me. But he does.
He does, yes.
He actually sees, and nothing escapes him. He knows the depths of the heart.
That's right.
And
he talks directly to her, so you can kind of imagine him, you know, his eye contact with her, talking directly to her. And again, men wouldn't have necessarily done that, especially.
No.
Well, I don't suppose she would have been welcomed anyway in the Pharisee's house.
Oh, goodness, no. I mean, you know, letting her hair down, you know, you do not show your hair, and, you know, so there's the whole thing would have been. But yes, but that bit, you know, he sees the woman, and again, is actually affirming her, and in the face of what could be other people's criticism, he's actually saying no, just like he did with the other Mary, you know, if this was Mary Magdalene, but it may well not have been. So yes, that again, we see his attitude is so different. Oh yes, there was another one which struck me when I was going through. We're coming on to some of his teaching, you know, and how he adapts it so that it's relevant for both men and women, and we'll look at that in a minute. But when the Sadducees came up with their question about the resurrection, you know, the guys who didn't believe in resurrection, and they tell this story about the man who married a woman, a woman who married a man, and then there were sort of 7 brothers, and, you know, under the law of the time, they were all dying childless, and she had to marry each of them. Whose wife would she be in the resurrection? Well, there's again a cryptic comment there. Well, not cryptic. Jesus says to them, you know, well, actually, you've missed the point on 2 fronts, but one of the things is that, you know, in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but you know, like the angels in heaven, not angels, they don't become angels, but they're like the angels in heaven. And I thought, again, now that's interesting, because talking about the resurrection, it applies not only to the men, but also to the women. Because in those days, you know, the people who married were men, the people who were given in marriage were women. Says, well, actually, in the resurrection, all that becomes irrelevant. You know, and I thought, wow, so women are definitely in the new creation that's coming. There isn't going to be, you know, the sort of the second-class citizen who happens to be female. You know, that somehow this is all going to be transcended back to the original plan of things, which I find very exciting. So yes. I've just said about his teaching, you know, in his teaching he deliberately tailors it to both sexes. Can you think of some examples of that?
I have, so the parable of the lost coin, so this is, I think it was the middle one between the parable of the lost, I can't remember the first one.
The lost sheep,
and
the then lost coin, and then the lost son. Yes.
And so the middle one was the parable of the lost coin, and he uses a woman, so it's the woman who's lost the coins and sweeps the house to find them. So I just thought the same was what you were just saying, really. That must have, in a kind of a man's world, hearing somebody teach using a woman's, an example of something that would be relevant to a woman, would kind of draw women in.
Well, that's right, yes, because the first parable he tells, talking about, you know, how the Lord is actually seeking the lost, you know, he talks about a man who's lost his sheep. And then a woman, because, you know, they used to have a ring of coins across their forehead, which it was her kind of, her dowry, you know, her possession. Because if, in those days, if somebody divorced their wife, they could throw them out straight away with only what she had with her. So that was actually her sort of insurance against finding herself destitute if her husband decided he didn't want her anymore. So actually losing one of those coins could be pretty serious, you know, one of those silver coins. And so immediately he then moves to the same principle of something very precious that's lost, and how when you've lost something very precious, you'll go to great lengths to find it. And he's using, we've had a man doing it, now we've got a woman. And
no, it's nicely balanced, really, isn't it? And there's the persistent widow as well, which was similar. I think that is a parable, isn't it? In Luke 18. So it's a widow. So again, probably not very important in society, female and a widow, but she's portrayed in the story as doing the right thing. So she's the one that's being persistent, asking for justice.
Yes, I think a while back when we were doing the parables on these conversations, I think Clive and I fell heir to this one, and that sense that you know, while this is to illustrate the importance of persistence in prayer, and he uses the illustration of a widow who can't get justice in a man's world, and obviously doesn't have a son or a brother to stand for her. She's actually having to go to court herself to deal with an unrighteous male judge who's dismissing her all the time. And actually he's sort of holding her up as an example and saying, well, it says that he told them this parable so that they would always pray and never give up. And he uses a woman as the illustration, and also a woman who's having to push herself into a man's world here, because, you know, normally it would have been the son or the brother that would have dealt with anything, but she's probably it's a vulnerable sort of figure, because you know, she can't get her inheritance, her justice. So yeah, that was another one.
That's actually I've just looked at my next one on my sheet here is the widow's offering. So when again, a widow in the temple that probably nobody else, they might have just dismissed her, but Jesus not just notices her, but actually commends her for what she does. But the comment that I put there is, again from the book that I read, it says, kingdom values are taught through a powerless woman while powerful men stand condemned. And it kind of reminded me a bit of the parable of the persistent widow. So not only is Jesus bringing women into his teaching, but he's actually he's using the powerless, the weak and the powerless, to kind of show up the people, the men that were in control and in power.
Yes, and yes, sort of using her to illustrate, when he sort of says, you know, she's given more than all the rest, because actually she's given everything she had, even though she had so little. And you know, I can well imagine that the ones who are coming with the trumpets sort of saying, look how much I've given. You know, it's the equivalent these days of, you know, when people sort of are giving to charity and there's a big presentation with a cheque about this size. You know?
That's right, yeah.
So look how much we're giving, right. You know. And often they aren't giving it, they've actually raised it from other people. But you know, it's all a big sort of flashy thing. And here's this woman sort of creeping in with her little coins that would hardly even hear falling in. And he draws attention to her. Again, he notices her.
Yes, notices her and sees the heart attitude. It's not just looking at the outward appearance, which is what you know, most of us do, I suppose, isn't it?
Yes, and really, I mean, we know that obviously it applies to men as well, that the Lord's not looking at the outward appearance, he's looking on the heart. But equally, he's just as interested in what's going on in a woman's heart. And it's not irrelevant.
No.
You know, it's actually really important.
Yeah.
Anything else here?
I think so.
No, still people
sound.
talking about sound. Oh well, the kingdom won't fall because the sound fell down. Yeah. There was another two things. Oh, I've lost it. Oh yes, that's right. When he's in Nazareth, sort of near the beginning of things, and they don't understand when he reads the passage which talks about the Messiah coming, you know, to the poor and the outcast and all the rest of it. But then what they kind of react to the fact that he's not talking about their enemies being destroyed. You know, it's all about the sort of the gospel of grace that he's offering. And then he uses two illustrations from the Old Testament showing that actually God was interested in Gentiles, but one is about Naaman and the other is about the widow of Zarephath. So, you know, again, man, woman. Yeah.
I didn't know whether you had any thoughts on this, but you know that when Jesus goes to raise the dead girl, so what's it?
Jairus' daughter.
Yes, that's right, the synagogue leader's daughter. Because apparently, so I've learned, is that women were kind of bracketed with children and slaves and had little worth. So this girl was female and a child. And I wondered whether, you know, for a synagogue leader to feel comfortable about going to Jesus to say, will you do something for my daughter? I don't know what you think about this, but do you think it was because of Jesus' reputation for raising the profile of women and the value of women that made him feel that, or do you think that would have just happened anyway?
Well, just because some people female children were bad news doesn't mean every
No.
father thought that, and
No.
obviously Jairus didn't.
No.
You know, he was absolutely desperate. I mean, that poor man must have been really fed up with Jesus taking notice of women, because, you know, the woman with the issue of blood, that stopped them on their rush to Jairus' daughter's house. You know, and he must have been sort of thinking, you know, what's this woman here for? I want you to come to my daughter. You know?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's certainly again the case. To Jesus, the woman on the way was just as important as the synagogue leader and his family, but equally, the little girl wasn't forgotten either.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to wrap up fairly early today because of all these little glitches we keep getting. Is there anything else we've... Oh yes, we've got to do an announcement before we finish, yeah. Is there anything else we've missed that you particularly wanted to mention?
I think I've said everything I'm prepared to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I think I just had a concluding comment really, which I'd kind of cobbled together out of the conclusion from the book. But just to sum up really what I was saying, I think what we've both been saying, Jesus' teaching reveals that he valued, made friends with, taught, challenged, inspired and protected women. He encouraged women to fulfil their potential as equal human beings in his kingdom. This was without precedent in the contemporary Judaism. And the teaching of Jesus communicated to women in ways which they could identify and assert their significance as equal to that of men in the kingdom.
And I think, you know, he really affirms the fact that women are just as valuable as men, even though they're not the same as men.
Yes.
You know, that God had a reason for creating man in his own image, male and female, he created them, you know, and actually a woman brings something of the reflection of the image of God, which a man can't. Just as a man brings an aspect of the image of God, which a woman can't, you know, I mean, it's not, you know, we're not sort of suggesting that men should now be downgraded. Actually, together, man and woman are meant to reflect the image of God. And that's the thing that Jesus is seeking to see restored in this particular area. And I know Luke sort of has obviously got hold of this particularly and focuses on it. And it's not in Luke, but I have to say it, you know, in John's Gospel, the woman who anointed Jesus with her perfume in John's Gospel seems to be the only person who actually understood what Jesus had said about what was going to happen, that he was going to die. The others didn't understand that didn't make sense, and that he was going to rise again because she brought it beforehand. Not like that, you know, and I think, well, that's interesting. She was a woman. In fact, it was Mary, the one who sat at his feet. So she obviously listened well.
Yes, she obviously did, didn't she?
Yeah. And she seems to have got it. Now, and I think it's So yes, this has been our particular focus now, and it's not that the whole focus of Luke's Gospel is about women. Of course it isn't. That's just the theme that we're particularly looking at tonight in our study of Luke. But yes, ladies, I hope you all know that in Jesus' eyes you are well affirmed and valued for what you are and who you are. Now, there is just one notice, given that they couldn't have the notices in the middle because of the sound. Next week there will be no Friday conversation. It's the half-term week. There's a lot of people away, and we actually haven't got the staff to be able to do the conversation next week. So there will be no Friday conversation next Friday, but we will resume again the following Friday, digging deeper in the Gospel of Luke.